I remember seeing the story that Walls was going to sign that hemp bill in Minnesota, and it's like, if this thing happens, this is going to be the first and quickest way to expand our business.
Who decides what is hemp and what is marijuana? Is THCA flower really hemp? You've all heard about hemp, but how does THC end up in it? You have plenty of these questions, and so do I.
The other way that you can get delta-9 THC is that you take that CBD from a plant, then basically pressurize it with an acidic catalyst, and that'll convert that CBD into delta-8 and delta-9 THC, which generally you will produce both of those things at the same time.
I've built my career on scaling businesses and turning obstacles into opportunities. I know how to navigate tough regulations and bring ideas to life, but even with all my experience, I don't have all the answers. Fortunately, I know people who do.
Point is, if I want to sell in as many states as I can, I have to meet as many state regulations as I can.
From gas station gummies to premium THC beverages, the hemp market is evolving rapidly. Today, we're sitting down with Adam Terry, co-founder of Cantrip, who's revolutionizing cannabis consumption.
From our trademark application denial that you could make a hemp beverage because our products are more than 0.3% delta-9 THC. Wait, I was like, wait a second, that's not true.
Adam takes us behind the scenes of crafting his innovative drinks, explains his strategic decision to exit the dispensary market, and reveals how emerging legislation is creating a new frontier for cannabis beverages in mainstream retail.
Producing in different states is very expensive, particularly with the cost of this equipment. But it's not just the cost of the equipment. The real thing that was the bear for us was the cost of inventory.
We'll explore the intricate dance between politics, regulation, and cannabis entrepreneurship. Plus, get his insider forecast on what's next for the rapidly evolving hemp-derived THC landscape. Ready for some game-changing insights? Let's dive in.
I'm Adam Terry, and I'm the CEO of Cantrip, a THC drink.
The THC drink.
Yeah.
Now, there have been a lot of those. That's actually huge in the news right now, THC drinks. What's a THC drink?
A THC drink is a beverage with THC in it, pretty simply put. Delta-9 THC usually, sometimes other forms of THC, though I found that those are kind of becoming out of fashion now that Delta-9 is becoming more popular.
Oh, interesting. You were talking about obviously the variants and stuff like that, the THC molecule. Right?
Yeah, take like 4 letters, put it in a string, and you have a new cannabinoid. That's how some people are doing business.
Yeah, exactly. But before we go too deep down that side, take me back. Why did you get into this industry?
Yeah, so I've been in the cannabis industry since 2015. Started working out in California in vapes. Worked for a local MSO here in Massachusetts and New Hampshire for a while. And then in 2020, I decided to start my own business. So I looked around, I asked, what is the most difficult thing to do that caused me the most pain in my life? And that would be put THC into water. Ideally, the difficulty of it gives you a competitive advantage, which I think is rapidly vanishing. But that's what I decided to do. I was a bartender for a long time too, so sort of the nexus of my interest in cannabis and flavors and beverages are what drove me to want to create a beverage and create something low dose. So we launched here in the Massachusetts dispensary market in June of 21. Did that for a couple of years.
So June of 21, obviously that was so long ago at that point. It's almost 4 years ago.
Yeah, almost 4 years.
Since you launched one of the first drinks in the Massachusetts market. And I think you're right. You hit the nail on the head when it comes to the evaporation of the technical advantages of making a cannabinoid put into water.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people are like, oh my God, you can drink weed. I'm like, yeah, you can drink weed. And people are like, well, have you considered patenting your process?
Every time.
And I'm like, no, it's like solved. Like there's so many different providers out there of all this stuff. It's just, there's nothing necessarily like new under the sun when it comes to this stuff too. So for us, it's, for our product specifically, we're like, as long as it's fast acting, you make it taste good, we're happy. We don't have to necessarily like shop around even if we don't want to. But all the way back in June 2021 was a different era.
Yeah.
What, I guess, did you bootstrap it? Like, were you just like scrappy or like, we got to get launched? Did you have to partner with people?
Yeah, so we didn't have really much capital at all when we launched. So when my co-founder and I started the business in 2020, we knew we'd have to raise some money. So we raised as minimal as we could. Our first round was $375,000, which was actually oversubscribed from what we planned. And thank God for that, because we definitely burned money faster than we thought we were going to. But the plan was always to go after it through sort of a kind of novel co-packing intellectual property licensing structure, which did somewhat exist at the time in Massachusetts, but was pretty rare. if you remember back then, I think there were only 5 or 6 licensed manufacturers that weren't part of vertical companies at that time. You might have been one of them at that moment. And so we launched with a small marijuana-infused ice cream manufacturer in Framingham, where I founded the company. And we were able to essentially raise enough money just to get basic canning equipment and basic extras that we would need to do it compliantly inside this marijuana license, moved it into Cloud Creamery, and then we started manufacturing with our own staff, which really meant that I was doing it for about 17 hours a day for a couple, not a couple years. It felt like a couple years. I think it was like 9 months. That was the majority of how we produced things back in the early
So you were hand canning everything yourself?
Yeah, cask MCS, which is a very manual system, basically a filler head and a seamer that you press a button on, it goes up and seams it. We got them pre-shrink sleeved, which was its own logistical nightmare, so we didn't have to run it through a labeler or apply hand labels.
So the labels came in already on the cans.
The can decorations, I should say, because the production labels we still had to apply by hand.
Sticker each single one.
Everyone.
So take me back to those days a little bit. So you're sitting in there and you're thinking to yourself, I believe in drinks. I believe in the beverage market. And back then there was Levia had launched, got a ton of press.
When we started this business, Levia didn't even have a license. And with the licensing time that it normally takes, I thought we'd still launch ahead of them because they hadn't even applied. So they got that thing expedited. I think they went from application to full licensure in 6 months. Yeah. Even though they'd spent a couple of years building that facility.
I recall those days too, because I didn't even know Levia existed when we were in the process of building our facility. And so it's funny how they were all coming up at the same time.
Yeah, everybody had a light bulb moment in 2020, drinks are the way of the future.
Yeah, definitely. And so it also High Five, I think, from Theory was just coming around that time.
I think they made it just 5 days after Levia or something, April of 2021. Yeah. And then Can made it to market, I think, in May of that year. So I think we were technically the 4th to market. With a beverage at June 30th, 2021 is the first day that we shipped product.
But Can also does licensing. And so we're talking about co-packing. So take me through co-packing. So you own the brand.
Yeah, so we own the brand, the formulas. Now, the situation we had in the early days was less traditional co-packing and more of a middle road.
Leasing a space, basically.
Yeah, Can calls what they do asset light, which means they don't own any equipment. They basically outsource all of that to somebody else, which is very expensive. So we wanted to walk a middle road, particularly because my background is engineering. So I wanted to leverage that and hopefully get a better price on being able to actually produce it in somebody's facility. So I said to the folks, we will handle all of the manufacturing. I will even handle the compliance elements. I've been in Massachusetts cannabis for a long time. I know how to do all of this. And I will bring in equipment and staff, and we will just get them all badged into your facility, and we'll facilitate it there. You guys will just have to handle essentially taking the money in for us and then paying us for the product. The way that Can does and the way that most people do it now, we eventually moved to this model, was don't have any equipment, just have somebody else do it. Let that be their investment, and then they will make that money back, co-packing multiple brands. And so that is the most common way, I think, to make a beverage if you're a small startup brand in America at this point. This is not necessarily as true with something like a brewery, which people do tend to invest in their own facilities, but for a light lift beverage like a seltzer or a tonic or a soda, it makes a lot more economic sense because it takes a long time to make your money back on these big, expensive canning lines, as you well know. And in order to do that, usually you end up having to co-pack somebody else anyway. Yeah. If you want the most sophisticated capabilities, you're gonna need a very expensive facility that takes a lot of time to pay back. So the way I always think about it in any CPG product, if you want to go co-packing and asset light versus own your own equipment, a lot of that comes down to what is the economic density of the product. So a canned beverage, generously wholesale will go for $2, right? A cartridge, this big can go for 20 to 25 wholesale. I mean, back when I started Cantrip, it was $35 wholesale.
I bet.
$30 a gram for distillate in 2021. But if you're just making vapor cartridges, they're pretty easy to make and they have a high dollar value, right? So for $100,000, you can get set up and start manufacturing them. For beverages, just for a small scale, you're probably spending $500,000. Yeah. I think we spent $70,000 on our equipment. That was very small scale. So it just takes a long time to pay back. So if you're doing something very economically, not dense like a beverage, you're usually going to be with a co-packer for a long time.
I mean, that makes a ton of sense because in our experience, we have a $120,000 bottling line just sitting there collecting dust right now because it just the economic the density, I think that's a really great term, actually. It was just not there. And I didn't think I didn't do the math. There was no like math formula that I did. Like, okay, when do I pay off this equipment? It's probably something I should have looked at because knowing that in many ways, I went into this also super naive too. I was kind of just like, all right, I'm just going to make drinks and we're just going to make it, we're going to figure it out. You know, you build the airplane as you fly it.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, I was like, because people were like, oh yeah, you got to do Keystone. So in the wholesale market, there's Keystone.
Yeah, the markup.
Yeah, for the markup.
Yeah.
So I think, many people, and this is specifically in the marijuana side of Massachusetts, or we also call Massachusetts cannabis, but it's the MJ market, basically, is 100% markup above and beyond what you're selling it for wholesale. So if you sell a cart for $20, they're going to mark it up to $40 at retail.
Yeah.
Now, if you're vertical, you get all that margin. You take it from seed to sale and you do everything. But if you're just a brand, you're sitting between where you're buying the distillate, right? And then you're making your product and you're selling it to retail.
Yeah.
If we're selling a drink, for instance, back in the day at $3.50 wholesale, $7 retail, right? I didn't even do that math to figure out like, all right, $3.50, how long is it going to take me? How many units do I have to sell even just to make my money back in the...
And so that retailer, their margin is going to be $3.50 minus, the cost of running that retailer. Your margin is going to be the cost of producing your bottle and $3.50, which means it's definitely less than $3.50. And then you add all your costs. And so the manufacturers who are just running manufacturing get the squeeze the most in these supply chains. And with Keystone markups, you also can't drive the price down. So if you're competing with somebody who's completely vertical, you can't get your price lower than them.
No.
Which is ironic because Levia kind of drove the pricing in those early days and they were completely vertically integrated.
Yep.
But back before 2021, it wasn't until 2019 in Massachusetts you even could wholesale.
Right.
Because it was illegal before then. You had to be a vertically integrated medical marijuana manufacturer. Then some rec license came on, but largely everybody was producing for themselves. And then in the early days, no one was even paying for product. They were just trading product. It was, you have enough flour, you have MIPS, and we're going to trade that back and forth.
Yeah.
When Cantrip launched, and probably not long after that was Good Fuels, there was only 65, 70 licenses in the entire marketplace. Not that many stores, but as the market expands, it horizontalizes, and suddenly manufacturers are being squeezed. Nobody can afford to produce a beverage anymore, and it stops making sense to do it. And so you launch other products to make up those margins.
Yeah, and strangely enough, I was looking at the beverage market the other day in Massachusetts because we no longer sell our drinks in Massachusetts.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, so we ceased to do our bottles.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because it's cost prohibitive.
Yeah.
And onesie twosies. It's just like, here's a case or two, and it's like, what are you doing here? Like, whereas obviously in a different market, like the hemp market,
not factoring in
pallets
transfer costs and vault sizes.
Exactly.
I remember Native Son, which has a vault in their basement, I think had mentioned to me once that yours were troubled because they're so heavy and they had to carry them up and down the stairs.
It's not like to add our drinks at all. And every time, and then they were also saying every time a customer walks out with a 6-pack and it goes clink, clink, they get worried that it's going to break immediately.
Yeah.
They get super. So it's just like there was so many problems with the way we kind of launched that. But at the same time, I'm kind of that bull in a china shop. I'm just like, let's just break a bunch of stuff and we'll put the pieces back together, figure out what it is. But back to your story, though, when it comes to the Massachusetts market, so you initially got success too. I still hear people talk about your drinks in the Massachusetts market.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, that people still I still get emails occasionally asking why our dispensaries are out of stock on our product, even though we haven't produced anything for the Massachusetts dispensaries since the end, I think August of 2023. It's been that long.
I bet.
So it's, it just, when you're producing a beverage, and this is the thing that we all of us ran into the same wall at the same time, right? And I think, their asset light model recognized this very early, which is that producing in different states is very expensive, particularly with the cost of this equipment. But it's not just the cost of the equipment. The real thing that was the bear for us was the cost of inventory. When we launched hemp in 22, we were sitting, we produced $40,000 to $50,000 worth of inventory in our first run. I think that's all we did. And for us, first of all, that was a huge revenue boost based on what because we were, by the time we moved out of that ice cream shop, we moved to a royalty-based model where somebody else is taking care of everything and paying us a royalty. It's 9%. So we're not taking in any money, basically $8 to $10 a month. And then
it seems like a pain in the butt for everybody involved.
Everybody involved. No one was having
back for the royalty. Oof.
No one was having a good time. Yeah. No one was making really any money because the co-packer didn't feel like they were making enough money based on the amount we felt like we were making. So we launched hemp and immediately we're actually pulling in real money. But now we're sitting on at that point we had grown sales to, I don't know, some like few thousand cases a month in Massachusetts. So we're sitting on couple $100,000 of inventory in Massachusetts at any given time.
Yep.
And eventually I did the math. I'm like, if we just stop doing this, basically that's like injecting a couple $100,000 into our business, because we're carrying, X $100,000 of inventory in hemp, X 100,000 in mass. And so in order to stay efficient, because we're not a well capitalized business in the sense that like we have big rich backers who we can just go back to for cash all the time. We've raised, I think, 3 times in our total existence, and you have to make it work with what you got, or you fold. Like, those are the 2 options. And so by cutting the Massachusetts market, all of that basically got reinvested in inventory and hemp, and now it can go basically anywhere. And so, around the same time as when I first saw Cycling Frog in liquor stores in Massachusetts, and I was like, why am I even still doing this here?
Right.
If Cycling Frog's showing up at my local liquor store down the street, and that's a whole other story that I'm sure we'll get to at some point. But after that, it was just like, we just can't keep doing this and continue to grow.
Didn't financially make any sense.
No, and I didn't even realize you guys were not making beverages for the dispensaries anymore, but it did. You're right. It doesn't make any sense.
No, it didn't make any sense. We actually stopped basically end of 23 ourselves.
Okay.
We switched into, because we were launching our hemp drinks around, I think we launched February 24.
Okay.
Finally. It took us, I'm not going to get into the whole story behind how long it took us to get in there, because we were supposed to be launched a year before that, basically. Because we also saw Cycling Frog in our local liquor store, and we were like,
Cycling Frog,
what do these guys do? Like, how are these guys in our local liquor store?
Yeah.
And we're like, and people were buying. And I actually ran into somebody I knew at a liquor store. And I saw Cycling Frog and they were like, oh, I love these because I can get these in my store now, because she used to be buying Cheech and Chong or something like that, online, gummies or something like that. And so she's like, I just like that it's in the liquor store now, so I can just buy it here.
You stop and pick up a 6-pack of beer. You can stop and pick up a 6-pack of Cycling Frog.
Exactly.
And like, what that is, there's a beauty in that when you and I got started in this business in cannabis beverages on the marijuana side, it was like, people would ask me, so when do you think these things will end up in regular stores?
Oh, all the time.
10, 15 years
All the
from now
time.
for lucky.
Yeah.
And then, I remember seeing the story that that Walls was going to sign that hemp bill in Minnesota in I don't know, the first time I saw the story, I think it was May of 22. It's like, if this thing happens, this is going to be the first and quickest way to expand our business without having to enter another dispensary state. And so I was like, this is going to change everything.
I remember when that happened, and I think a lot of people were like, did Minnesota just legalize weed and not realize it?
I'm pretty sure the Republicans didn't realize.
Yeah, they didn't realize it.
The way I heard it, the Republicans didn't even read that bill because they thought it was doing something with Delta 8, and they're like, this was at a time where it wasn't super culturally cool as a Republican to be reading legislation. It was more about getting sound bites.
Right.
And this guy Ryan Winkler, who was the I think the majority leader in the Minnesota Assembly at that point, or House, whatever they call it there, he moved this bill forward to deal with the Delta 8 issue because of a court case that had been working its way through the courts about hemp. And then it just suddenly legalized Delta 9 at 5 milligrams per serving up to 50. It had a few regulations around it. Technically, you couldn't sell in liquor stores at that time, but all of a sudden you have a place where this thing that we had known existed, because Cycling Frog already existed by then. High Spirits already existed by then. Even Cheech Chong might have been selling these. I knew actually from our trademark application denial that you could make a hemp beverage, because it specifically said when I got denied for the Cantrip trademark, which I knew was going to happen, I just applied for it anyway. It said because our products are more than 0.3% Delta 9 THC. Wait, I was like, wait a second, that's not true. Our products are not more than 0.3% by weight, even on a dry weight basis. Right. We have 2 grams of sugar in our seltzers, and so even if you evaporated every molecule of water out there, it would still be under 0.3%. I was like, could you make this from hemp? So I started calling around some of the hemp guys in Massachusetts, and they're like, I'm not saying anything, but we've heard of it happening. And then 3 months later, Minnesota legalizes this. I'm like, well, this has got to be something that we go after pretty quickly. And we started with just Minnesota. We wanted to keep the whole supply chain there, just at an abundance of caution. And then when that was starting to be successful, we realized Tennessee's got a law about this. Then we started just moving from there, and it was just not too long before everything started picking up speed. Yeah.
So you mentioned a bunch of terms there, but basically, Minnesota passes a law that says you could have 0.3% THC, Delta 9 THC is acceptable in hemp for Minnesota. Yeah. And then you basically got a trademark denied for Cantrip, and it said, hey, if you're less than 0.3, we kind of would have accepted it, but since you weren't, we don't
Not
accept
true. I mean, the reason that we got denied should have said because you're selling marijuana.
Right.
But it didn't say that. It said, because I applied for it, so we had CBD in our products. So I applied for the CBD beverage category because that is a existing category for trademarking. And when it got denied on the principle that it was more than 0.3%, but I was like, that's not actually true now. I didn't really have the funds to hire a trademark attorney at that point. So we've gone back around that cycle at this point. Yeah. But that's when I realized that this is a possibility. And a quick side story on when they passed that law, like 6 months after that, election comes and goes. Ryan Winkler decides not to run for office again. The man started a hemp beverage company. You know what it's called? Crooked.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's funny. And they're out there. I mean, he's still running that company.
In Minnesota.
In Minnesota, they're in all sorts of places. I've seen them. They like have the child resistant like toppers on them.
Okay.
Boxes. But yeah, I mean, he could have picked any name for his company.
But Crooked.
Yeah, it didn't really help Democrat reputations, but
so you saw this opportunity, you jump in it, you basically say, hey, Massachusetts, I'm done. Let's just take that inventory, sell through whatever you got left, and then we're just moving.
Fire sale everything as quick as we could. Our co-packer was not necessarily sorry to see us go. They're great guys over there, but I don't think they co-pack anymore either.
They don't co-pack drinks anymore.
Yeah, it didn't make any sense.
I get phone calls all the time asking people if I can co-pack for them, and I'm like, I haven't been doing drinks for.
I remember right after we launched the hemp drinks, I was standing there in that facility during the startup of a different hemp beverage brand, which I won't name. Or I'm sorry, a cannabis beverage brand I won't name. And I was talking to them about hemp. They're like, oh, that's going to be closed by the end of this year when the Farm Bill renews. I was like, I guess we'll see. And, I think like a year later, they shut down their marijuana operations and now they, run a hemp beverage company.
Yep. Yeah. And I actually tipped off a bunch of people to it because I remember very vividly being at like Harvest Cup or something like that with the, DCU Center events. And people were asking me like, what's new, what's next? I went wink, like, you should be in hemp beverage. You shouldn't be doing this right here. Like, it doesn't make any sense for you to be selling onesie twosie because when you're walking into a dispensary, it's like a nice add to cart. Like, hey, here's $7 to like have one can of
plus 20% tax.
Plus 20% tax on top of it versus the natural kind of ebbs and flows of a person's day where they go to the liquor store after work or something like that to grab a six pack. You naturally fit into that channel versus kind of the dispensary channel. So, but I mean, there's so much to unpack here. You'd mentioned Delta 8, you mentioned Delta 9. Delta 9 THC is the one that people know it as far as THC.
Yeah.
When people mention THC, they're really talking about Delta 9
Historically speaking, when we say THC, we mean Delta 9 THC. That's why on our cans it just says 10 milligrams of THC or 5 milligrams of THC. We don't specify it in most places on the can except for a couple of fine print because we want that behavior to continue.
Right.
Delta 8 was sort of a side path that people took at the beginning of the hemp industry when, it was, because the Farm Bill specifically allows up to 0.3% Delta 9 THC.
Right.
It says nothing about any other isomer of the THC, and Delta 9 is what's naturally occurring, of course. It can be made synthetically as well, but Delta 9 is naturally occurring in the plant. Delta 8 does occur naturally in the plant, but I think we both know not in materially large amounts.
And I think that's a lot of, and I agree with you with just saying THC.
Yeah.
Because when people start making all the deltas and stuff like that, they get confused, they get scared even because they're like, oh, Delta 8 and all this other stuff.
I was in DC a few months ago on the Hill just doing some lobbying, and one of I think it was a staffer from like South Carolina or one of the Carolinas said to me, you guys aren't talking about those deltas, are you? Like that's what they know about is they hear the word delta, and that that is a trigger word essentially in this industry right now. Despite the fact that Delta 9 THC is I have to convince so many people that Delta 9 THC from hemp, when made in a certain way, is chemically identical to the Delta 9 THC that comes from marijuana, but some people just don't believe it.
I think there's a lot of, and so since I am in both worlds, right? I have a marijuana license. I'm a marijuana product manufacturer, MPM, in Massachusetts. I'm licensed by the CCC. And I also have a hemp line of products that are made outside of the state. Like I'm in one foot in the other all the time, right? Depending on who I'm talking to, there's different conversations that happen. But often I hear from people being like, all these things are synthetic and all these other things. Like, I don't believe you. Like, how could you grow all these plants and isolate just that Delta 9 fraction and stuff like that? Like, take me through that a little bit. Like, what does that even mean? Because you said isomers too.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like there's a whole chemistry set of things behind what a lot of people believe hemp people are doing, and then there's the natural way.
Right. Yeah. So it's relatively complicated, but it's also kind of simple at the same time. You can get Delta-9 THC grown from a plant. It takes a lot of hemp to do that. With the cap at 0.3% Delta-9, and frankly, most biomass comes in well below that if it's qualifying as hemp. I think most of the COAs I see are like 0.06 to 0.15% Delta-9 THC. And that includes the calculation for THC, because USDA regulations do account for THCA in the total THC calculation. Now, that's not a statute, that's a regulation. We won't get into that difference right now. The point being that the biomass that goes to the place where our stuff is processed gets extracted. You end up with a crude extract that is heavily CBD. And then there's like 2% Delta-9 THC in there. Mm-hmm. And what they run that through is a series of chromatography steps. There's something called centrifugal partition chromatography. It's funny, as a guy I went to UMass with, who's also a chemical engineer, he now sells those as like so I'll see him at trade shows every once in a while. But that is basically a really fancy multi-state. It can run like 100 chromatography steps in a really quick succession using centrifugation as a method of driving the pressure.
Yeah, because when I think of chromatography, I think of like the time going through a tube.
Is running through a column, right? But the reason you have regular chromatography, which is just atmospheric pressure, it's just gravity and buoyancy is driving something down. Then you have HPLC, right? What does the HP stand for? High pressure liquid chromatography. Right. So you're using a pump to drive it. Then there's UPLC, which is ultra pressure. HPLC is the standard for testing for potency in a cannabis product, because it's a way of isolating the Delta-9 THC to see how much is in there. Mm-hmm. CPC is essentially doing that, but multiple times in rapid succession. Instead of using a pump to drive it forward, it's using centrifugation to drive that. Mm-hmm. And so what you end up with then is another sub-step of a crude extract that is, I don't know, some percentage of THC, and then that gets run through traditional distillation. I mean, not traditional, but molecular distillation, which has been in the industry for 10 years now. And that ends up with a distillate. That distillate is somewhere between 85 and 90% Delta-9 THC. And this is where you'll really see it as more of a natural, more full spectrum product. So you'll see a little bit of CBC in there, a little bit of CBN, a little bit of CBG, these naturally occurring what we call phytocannabinoids, right? And that's where you can really tell this thing came naturally and not synthetically, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then you take that, you emulsify it, and you put it in a product. So that's the general way you get the natural stuff. Now, that takes a lot of hemp. You were talking, honestly,
that takes a giant
3,000 to 4,000 pounds of hemp for a liter of distillate in most cases. And so we grow a lot of hemp in this country. I mean, when you compare the square footage of what we grow in Massachusetts in what are largely indoor grows to the outdoor farms that they have in Kentucky and Tennessee, North Carolina, I mean, the difference is just mind-boggling. It's amazing to me that we still mostly grow marijuana indoors in Massachusetts.
That's very...
Whole other conversation about testing regs and why that's like 10% of all commercial electric goes to indoor grows in this state, which is a crazy figure.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, Samantha Woodman told me that. And she told me that like 3 years ago, and then I asked her last year, is that still true? And she's like, yeah, it's still true.
10% of all electricity.
All commercial electric. But yeah, that's the majority of it, right?
Wow.
So... the other way that you can get Delta-9 THC is that you take that CBD from a plant. You then basically pressurize it with an acidic catalyst, and that'll convert that CBD into Delta-8 and Delta-9 THC, which generally will produce both of those things at the same time. Now, they're really similar to each other, so they're actually kind of hard to separate. You can completely separate them using chromatography if you want, but most people end up with something like a 5-to-1 Delta-9 to Delta-8 or a 10-to-1 Delta-9 to Delta-8. So when you look at the extract or even the emulsion, typically you will still see Delta-8 in there. And that's how you can tell something has been basically converted CBD.
Right.
That is a lot of the Delta-9 in the hemp industry.
Yeah, so for consumers out there, if they're trying to figure out if the products they're consuming has from converted source, meaning from CBD converted into Delta-8, Delta-9, trying to obviously get the Delta-9 portion is what they're trying to go after, but there's going to be residual other cannabinoids in like a Delta-8.
And you often won't see that in like a beverage because it's so dilute, but you might see it in like the intermediate steps. You should, if you're buying a product, you should be asking the manufacturer how it's created. Right. We put a little thing on our can that says naturally extracted Delta-9 THC, and that's what that means, but... obviously, I spent the last 5 minutes of a podcast explaining what that means. So it's not like everybody's going to get that just from seeing the button.
Right. Right, exactly. And, there's education in that as well, which is why I think moving away from the Delta name and just saying it's THC, because it's a naturally derived source of THC as well. Whereas I think a lot of people, especially in the Massachusetts cannabis side, the people I hear from, the constituents in Massachusetts specifically who are owner-operators specifically, not necessarily MSOs, they don't really pay me any mind, but the owner-operators, I hear a lot of people being like, gas station gummies and like your kid, think of the children and all this other stuff. Like gas station gummies, I think that's obviously like a huge deal right now.
Yes, look, the hemp industry has come a long way. In 2019, right after the Farm Bill legalized hemp, you did have a lot of stuff like CBD coming from China because they grow a lot of hemp in China. And you know why that is? They grow it in China to remediate waste sites because cannabis is really good at absorbing whatever's in the soil near it. And so they'll take that, process it into textiles, and then they'll take the goop from it, extract that CBD out of that, and you end up with these like really crappy products. And they're not tested. So we did a lot of really bad hemp in gas stations in 2019. Now it's improved. Not all gas station hemp is bad hemp, but it's not all good hemp either. And that's like they're materially salient points when people do point out that there are issues with the hemp industry, and that's why the hemp industry, the good actors spend so much time trying to get regulated. I've literally spent the last year of my life actively working on trying to get this industry regulated, and particularly.
So you want regulations?
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't want, because everybody's talking about how much easier it is in hemp. There's no regulations. It's a Wild West. Again, a lot of people I speak to are just like, it's out there and these guys have, free reign to do whatever they want. But that's not really the case, is it?
Yeah, it's not really true. I mean, when you think about it, one of the material advantages and the reason that we make hemp products is because we want to sell them across state lines in multiple states. Well, the only way to do that is to meet the regulations in those states. And there are states that regulate, right? First and foremost, Minnesota and Tennessee. Georgia now has regulations. Florida just introduced some pretty draconian regulations. And if you want to sell in a state, you have to meet the regulations because there are enforcement agencies that deal with this. So if you want to sell in Minnesota, you better meet Minnesota guidelines. Well, now I'm not going to make a different can for Minnesota than I'm making for North Carolina. And so I have to make sure that I'm meeting as many state regulations as I possibly can. I did an exercise where I tried to get as many states' warning language onto this can as possible. I could only do 35. Yeah. And that really includes a lot of states that don't have a ton of warning language on them right now. But to include Minnesota and the Prop 65 warning for California, which is a state we can no longer sell in, and to get the National Poison Control Center on the number on there because we thought we were going to need that in Florida. All of that is basically an entire panel on my beverage just to meet that compliance. So I do have to meet those compliance standards. We actually test for more things on Cantrip products now than we did in the marijuana industry because we don't, even though I do actually have COAs for almost every intermediate step of the cannabis, because that's not as tightly tracked as it is in metric here, I test for pesticides, microbials, mycotoxins, heavy metals, residual solvents, and potency on every one of our products every single time, every single batch. And in Massachusetts, you have to test for potency, microbials, and mycotoxins on the finished panel because it's presumed that you passed the tests from before. Yes, there's some flaws in that thinking, like the idea that you could never introduce a heavy metal outside of the cannabis element.
That is definitely true. I remember we talked about the HACCP a lot.
Yeah,
in our facility, making sure that we're removing any potential issues.
Yeah, if you boil water for gummies and there's heavy metal in the water, you're gonna leave heavy metals behind. Right. But the system we have now just assumes that if it came anywhere, it came from the cannabis concentrate. But that's neither here nor there. The point is, if I want to sell in as many states as I can, I have to meet as many state regulations as I can. And there are some people in the hemp industry who are not as familiar with that. So they get these new Florida regulations out, and suddenly there's sort of, vague language like, what does a cartoon mean on packaging? Now, we've been dealing with that in the marijuana industry for a decade.
Oh, yeah.
It's very vague. In a state like New Hampshire, you basically can't put a picture of a fruit on your product.
I heard about that one, too.
Yeah, I did some work in New Hampshire. It was miserable. And then Massachusetts, Lowell Smokes has a goat on the front of their packaging. Is
that a cartoon or not?
I don't know. Right. And that's the thing. So we have all these complaints in marijuana that, regulators basically decide different things depending on who the regulator is and what they had for breakfast that day. And now some of that's kind of coming for the hemp industry, and people are concerned. And for me, I'm just like, this is just why we don't put fruit pictures on our cans. Yeah, it's just part of it.
Exactly. And, and sometimes, the old adage of moving fast and breaking things can backfire on you too, because you might be very progressive and be like, we're going to put, and you could actually think about the gas station gummies again. the bad operators that are out there, they're taking like Skittles, and
they never cared about any of this regulation.
They're not listening to any of this stuff. They're just making their money and they're getting out of here.
That's exactly right, and that's why we need to have regulations, because without regulations and taxes, there's no way to enforce against these people, right? Cantrip was in a slide deck by some people who were trying to, progress a ban in a state. And it's like Cantrip's Ginger Peach was our lowest dose product, 3 milligrams of THC, tested, warning language, child-resistant lids. We still use those in the hemp side, which I get a lot of flack for, frankly, from my compatriots in hemp. And that's sitting next to a 500 milligram THC piece Skittles package. I'm just like, these are not similar products.
Yeah, no, not the same.
Yeah. Look, at the end of the day, both hemp and marijuana companies, they are running businesses. And so they're compelled, especially if they have investors, to do what's in the best interest of their shareholders. That is basically a legal requirement if you're a fiduciary for a company. And so if you are a marijuana company, it's your best interest and your imperative to basically try to prevent markets. This is why I don't actually hate MSOs for what they do, because frankly, that's their job. We as vaguely as voters in different states created these sort of regulatory capture models, and a lot of people got mad when companies did exactly what they were expected to do, which is try to win in the regulatory capture model.
They're going to look at those rules and they're going to say, how can I make this really in my favor?
Yeah, that is their obligation under probably the articles of organization of their company and the law if they're a fiduciary for it. At the same time, that's why we need to work on the political process to create a system that's fair rather than just blaming the companies inside there. So if somebody in Massachusetts is saying, well, I don't want hemp here because I have a stake in not having more competition, I respect them for that. Now, if they're lying to get that accomplished, then that's a whole other thing, because that's not necessarily within their obligations. But at the end of the day, everybody's going to fight for what is necessary for their company to survive, and that's just the capitalist system we live in.
So what is fair? Say, for instance, in Massachusetts had a short little run of beverages, and then everybody got booted out because of, I think, the alcohol, the ABCC.
Yeah, the ABCC threatened to revoke liquor licenses for those who were selling the products, which means why you still see them to some extent in like corner stores and such.
Yeah, somebody.
For anyone who's willing to sell those, which is not a lot of the beverage guys, but again, the people selling fake Skittles, they never really cared about the law, because even if they get slapped down, they'll just open up somewhere else.
Yeah, they just open a new shop.
What is fair is a really big question that I don't think we're going to answer on a podcast. But I can tell you that there is a bill that is in front of the legislature right now, an act to regulate hemp-derived beverages like alcohol is the title of the bill. They just changed the bill number, so I can't remember what the new bill number is.
This is Massachusetts.
This is in Massachusetts. Essentially, what it would do is it would allow just beverages from the hemp system onto liquor store shelves. Only off-premise is going to be the place where it starts. It's going to have the same cap as the dispensaries at 5 milligrams, and if that cap raises the dispensaries, so with this cap, which hopefully aligns the political incentives, and it will force everything through the 3-tier system. So there's going to be sort of a way of bringing it in a way that is more akin to what we do with beer right now. So there'll be a certificate of compliance. You have to be tested. It'll be regulated, and it'll be saleable only at liquor stores and only at dispensaries. So dispensaries would be able to pursue it too.
Oh, dispensaries will also have access.
Yeah, so dispensaries would be able to, say, purchase hemp good fields and sell them there as well. So that would be a method for some of these, these dispensaries to participate and hopefully get lower costs too, because those also wouldn't be subject necessarily to the 20% tax. Now, it's a little harder on the people who produce in the state, but the people who produce in the state would also have the ability under this bill to manufacture from hemp instead of marijuana these same products and sell them and get all the same advantages.
Right, and now all the operators who currently make drinks in the Massachusetts market and marijuana side can now make the hemp version of it and sell it to liquor stores.
That's correct. They still have to source it as hemp instead of marijuana. They couldn't take, the stuff they grow in the facility and turn it, but they could certainly source hemp, which is fairly cheap these days, turn it into beverages, and now they can sell it as one inventory, not just into dispensaries en masse, but also liquor stores en masse, and to places elsewhere that allow these beverages. And so that would, in my mind, make it more fair for the people who have spent all this time and effort, make sure they get licenses. Maybe your bottling line becomes worth something again, and you can participate in those systems, and there's no advantage from a cap perspective on liquor stores. And the way I see it is, we all know the numbers. 1% or less of sales in most dispensaries are beverage. People don't show up to dispensaries for low-dose beverages. People show up to dispensaries for weed.
Right.
And so they like higher-dose products. If someone is more willing to pick up a low-dose product, they're more likely to do it when they're already shopping for an intoxicant like alcohol. And so where we see 1% lift in dispensaries from beverages, you see 20 to 30% lift in liquor stores. And so I see that as a system that hopefully can work for everybody. Now, it wouldn't allow gummies. Certainly wouldn't allow THCA flower, which is a whole other questionably legal thing.
Yeah.
It would be just beverages here in Mass, and that's at least the place to start.
Yeah, and like now with the, because you hear stories all the time about like alcohol and beer sales being down, and a lot of the new generation people who are turning 21 aren't necessarily going directly and they're consuming a lot less liquor.
Yeah.
This might be a really good boon for the liquor stores too.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, definitely wholesalers and retailers are very interested in it. I don't know so much about beer suppliers, but they'd have to figure out what makes the most sense for them to.
Well, they could also manufacture them.
I think, they should be able to. If you have an ABCC license, you should be able to manufacture. I don't think you can serve on site under this new bill.
It's still
We're
off-premise.
trying to walk before we run, so I don't think there's going to be an. I think the current draft does have on-premise, but that may be redrafted at some point. But I don't think it would allow like on-site sales for a brewery. Something that conversations have been had with the Brewers Guild. But yeah, they'd be able to participate too. This bill would drive a sort of new system for all of these folks. So hopefully, no one is really left out of this system entirely.
Yeah, I think to me that sounds like it's starting to get to that fair approach, I guess. Right?
Hopefully. I mean, like, there's no such thing as completely fair, I think, in the world. We all try to create something. You could have a completely free market with no regulations is, in some ways fair, right? But then you have no way of protecting small guys. You have no way of protecting public health and consumers. So you need some amount of regulation. But, frankly, until cannabis is legal federally, I don't think we could have a completely fair system.
Right.
It's just, you will always have these folks who are spend all this time and effort getting these marijuana licenses in states, and they will be eternally disadvantaged to some extent because they can't sell. Now, they're also advantaged in the sense that they have a regulatory capture, right? If you have a dispensary license in Massachusetts, especially if you had one very early, you probably have a lot of good business and you're driving a lot of sales. It's a great business to be in. You're also paying more in taxes. And so it's going to run around in circles until we, get this plant fully legalized. But that's... Hopefully all of this drives that momentum forward because it's certainly kind of a toothpaste in tube situation.
Exactly. Because it's out there and it's not necessarily going away anytime soon.
It'd be very difficult. You have to recriminalize everything and start, arresting liquor store owners across the country, like mom and pop stores.
Right.
Minnesota did something recently where they created a wholesale license, but they didn't differentiate between a cannabis wholesale, like a marijuana wholesale license and a hemp wholesale license. And so those who wanted to sell only hemp products who have like alcobev licenses that would be entitled in the state of Minnesota holding this license to also sell marijuana. And if they did that, they'd become criminals, overnight in the eyes of the federal government.
Yeah.
So I think they're trying to fix that and create a new license type, but that was in the statute originally.
Right.
So there was some real confusion when they started getting to closer to rolling out adult use about how exactly that was going to work.
Yeah, because now Minnesota, do they have adult use yet, or the
adult use is basically coming online this year? It does. Some of the tribal dispensaries have opened up.
Okay.
I think most of the other, like the standard licenses, have not.
So they started with hemp, and they said, "Hey, this is good for us." And then they said, "All right, let's do a full adult use so people can actually buy flower and stuff like that."
Yeah, after they legalized hemp, I mean, they had a pretty strong sweep in 22 in the election. So the Democratic Farmers Labor whatever party there, the DFL. They were able to legalize marijuana. They were able to create universal school lunches. And Tim Walz, now national figure, but very progressive, decided to sign that bill. And so marijuana was legalized in 23. That was also the same bill that opened up liquor stores for sale for hemp products. And so now they're working their way through what every state has gone through, which is like the multiple year process it takes to stand up dispensaries, which I maintain does not need to take that long.
It doesn't. It shouldn't take that long.
I mean, we saw Missouri do it in like 3 months. And
I think Chicago also.
Chicago is
not Chicago,
quick.
Illinois, but yeah.
Illinois is pretty quick.
That pretty quick too.
But, the most of the stories are more like New York and Massachusetts than they are like that. Even California took 4.5 years to really go from Prop 64 to actually onlining the program.
Yeah, so that's the one thing, but those early kind of states, but New York, it doesn't really have. The way I always pitch New York to people is that having lived there for many years and seeing how a lot of this stuff works, they were inevitably going to mess it up at the beginning. Without a doubt. They're just going to be in their own way. 100%.
I've never lived in New York, so I couldn't
But
say.
once they get cranking, it's going to crank.
Oh, I mean,
They just had to get out of everybody's way.
Well, that was the shocking thing. Like after the first dispensaries opened, it was like a year of like they're doing like less than $100 million in total sales for the year,
There's
and
like
now
20
it's like they're on
stores
track
like
for like
that.
$2 billion or something. New
Yeah,
York
it's
finally
going to go quick.
I mean, there's a lot of people live in New York, and a lot of them smoke weed.
Yeah.
So
Well, and that's always been inherent in the culture there too, because there's been delivery for 20 years.
Yeah.
Or even longer, probably.
I remember going to visit a friend in Greenpoint in like 2018, and mind you, at this time I'm working for Temescal Wellness as a guy who makes vapes. So I bring my vape down. He's like, "You want vapes?" Like, he's got like 7 different vapor cartridges. I'm looking, he's like, "How do you know what's in any of these things?" He's like, "I don't."
Well, that's the crazy part. So, like, and I know the OCM or even just the NYPD, they've been cracking down a lot, the bodega stores and stuff like that. And how, because you already mentioned THCA flower, which we'd have to go too deep into, but like, what do you think, like I remember being there like even just like a year ago, and there was like Stizzy carts and all kinds of crazy like California brands in bodegas in New York City.
Yeah.
Like, how does that even happen? They just put it in the back of the
I mean, I'm not going to implicate anybody in a crime, but I'm pretty sure crimes were involved. I mean, I don't know. There's a huge culture of counterfeiting among successful brands in cannabis, so they could be. I mean, we can't actually be sure of that, because what happened in California is they had 15 years of Prop 215, right, or maybe 20 years, something like that, where they had this medical marijuana system. Medical marijuana didn't have seed to sale tracking. And so when they tried to put metric into place, it's kind of like trying to build a fence around a herd of cattle after you've already got the cattle there, instead of just moving them in. So it's been very difficult for California to crack down on illicit cannabis. It also makes it hard for them to enforce against legal operators. So who's to say some of those brands weren't finding a way to get it to California through burner distros instead of it being counterfeited? But I've seen counterfeit everything too. I've seen counterfeit can. You know, the beverage company a couple years ago, we were seeing like can, like they weren't quite the same flavor, but they said can on. It was like some flavor that they've never made before, and they were selling them in places. And so, people are certainly willing to. I mean, as soon as you legalize cannabis, you take away the criminal element, you have a lot more people willing to do a lot of things to make money, because they don't fear getting arrested. The worst happens is they lose their inventory.
Well, I think that was a lot of the argument for, I mean, even in New York City, I used to hear that all the time. It's like, if it ever becomes legal here, like the cops don't have, I mean, it was kind of the police were already kind of just like turning a blind eye to it.
How much time are they going to spend on it? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
There's a lot of things going on in New York.
There were situations. I remember I used to go to the gym with a couple police officers in Brooklyn, and I'd ask them sometimes and all these, random questions, because as a citizen, I'm like, I don't want to get in trouble either. I'm like, just got to figure like where the boundaries are here.
Yeah.
And so, but they'd be telling me stuff like, unless like we use it as a reason to go talk to somebody.
Yes.
But like if we just would walk.
You're just smoking weed, mind your own business. No one's going to bother you. And that was true for a while. Mass decriminalized in 2008.
Yeah.
I moved from New Jersey to Massachusetts in 2010, and it was like, wow, I could just smoke weed here. Yeah. And when I grew up in New Jersey, like you could not do that. Yeah. People, they would arrest kids for smoking weed all the time.
Well, that's and that's, my generation as well. Like it was obviously very frowned upon. And the stigma, but the stigma still exists. And I feel like it's weird to go to a state that's not legal and knowing that it's so free here to just be in doing it and stuff like that. It's part of my life. My kids know I consume and stuff like that. Whereas, you go to some other state where it's not legal, and it's just like, it's almost like I feel like almost hiding it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't spent that many time. Like, it's funny because now, because I drive between Mass and New Jersey all the time, it used to be like, okay, well, here I'm legal, here I'm not. And now it's just I drive from Mass to New Jersey, it's all legal all the way down. But even in more conservative areas here in Massachusetts, it's like when I was touring daycares for, we have a 20-month-old. When we were touring daycares for, I was just like, I'm not telling these people what I do for a living. Because I was afraid that we wouldn't get approved. We weren't going to let in. You still have to be afraid of child services if they know you smoke weed when, especially for mothers who are, giving birth. There's still all sorts of stigma that exists in legal states. But the crazy thing is now I have business that I do with THC drinks in Iowa and Tennessee and Kentucky, because it's legal up to 4 milligrams in Iowa. We have an Anheuser-Busch distributor out there who we work with. It's crazy the things that have turned around, because when you also look at a state like Massachusetts, which allows 0 milligrams of THC in a hemp beverage, somehow Iowa's become more progressive on this issue than Massachusetts. Yeah. The same with Georgia. Georgia's got a codification of this, and it's...
What's the limit in Georgia right now?
10 milligrams for a can, and then like if you're selling gummies, you can do 10 milligrams per gummy, which is more than Massachusetts rec, and 150 milligrams per container, which is also more than Massachusetts rec. Now, they've got a bizarre system right there, because the legislature, even though they passed this law literally last year, is already talking about banning beverages specifically now, but not gummies. It's a whole mess, and I'm sure there's some marijuana companies involved in that. Yeah. But in any case, like, you have places, the Southeast is just so strong for this stuff, and it, like, I saw more in red states than I do in blue states for the most part, with the exception of New Jersey right now.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. And like, so you've grown since leaving Massachusetts, obviously.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah. What's your team up to right now?
I think we're probably like 17 or 18 total head count at this point.
Dude, I'm so proud of you, dude. That's super. You. That's awesome.
Thank you. I mean, look, the opportunity afforded us by hemp needs to be taken seriously, right? Because like all of this can go away. Now, I don't expect it to. The Farm Bill's been kicked 2 years in a row. It's supposed to be
keeps on getting kicked down the road. Yeah.
I'm not sure it's going to pass this year. Yeah. Just like, because Congress can't do anything right now.
Well, it's also, I think for people who think about the Farm Act, everybody's thinking about, the hemp rules and loopholes and stuff like that. The Farm Bill is like 800 pages.
Yeah, it's a $1.5 trillion bill.
And I think hemp is like a page and a half.
It's not even. It's literally like 3 lines. The definition of hemp is like the only thing in there, because there's not, they don't have any regulations about it in the Farm Bill itself. It's really just the federal definition of hemp exists there. And there've been talk about changing that definition in several ways. And the reason I'm not too worried that's going to get eliminated overnight is because, like, you're talking about, particularly in a state like Minnesota or Tennessee, where all these participants exist, if you change that text, then immediately, without a single grace period, all those businesses become 280 businesses. They become criminal enterprises. Yeah. And are you going to do that to like the mom and pop liquor store around the corner in Tennessee or Minnesota? I think not, especially when you consider that both the senators from Minnesota are on the Ag Committee in the Senate. So I just don't think they'd allow that. Now, would they consider changes that eliminate THCA flower? I think that's very likely, because they could change the definition from Delta 9 to total THC and have a more flexible, expansive definition of that. They might do a couple things. We saw a lot of stuff proposed last year. That's all assuming we can pass this thing again this year, which is looking less and less likely, particularly because SNAP benefits is in the Farm Bill, and SNAP has become very controversial at the from a partisan level. Right. So whether or not they get enough votes, if they cut SNAP, it's hard to say. That's what some Republicans want to do. But I'm certain there are some Republicans who don't want to do that because they have districts that are have a lot of poor people and rely on them. But Bobby Kennedy thinks SNAP shouldn't be allowed to purchase less than healthy products. It's just all over the place.
That's the HS stuff. And the HHS was the group that came out and said Schedule 3 recommendation for the DEA, right?
I think HHS did make that recommendation, not under Robert F. Kennedy.
No,
but that was their original, and then that whole system's been. I honestly could not comment properly on rescheduling, because it's just. I mean, recently it came out that apparently the whole trial or rescheduling hearings thing was rigged, and it never really needed a hearing in the first place. So I don't know. I've been of the opinion for some time now that federal legalization is kind of a crapshoot. In fact, maybe we should just take a look and see how we can make the Farm Bill say 100% THC, and then just create a national regulation system through hemp, so we don't have to deal with the scheduling system anymore. But that's
that's wild. I mean, because I often think I remember there's an article back in probably like Marijuana Moment or something like that. And where RFK Jr. came out and said if he was elected president, he'd legalize it immediately or something like that.
Well, I saw the headline said legalize, and he said in the interview decriminalize, and then like the day after he was confirmed, he went on Fox News and says marijuana is like a gateway drug that causes schizophrenia.
It's crazy. Right?
It's like do you have schizophrenia, Mr. Kennedy? Is that what's going on, Mr. Secretary? I don't know. That's what I'm like. I'm not that optimistic. I mean, look, historically speaking, Democrats have been better for at least legalizing cannabis than not. Now they're not great on the hemp issue in a lot of places, especially at the local level. They're not great even at the national level right now, right? That's a lot of people feel it's Democrats' fault that things haven't progressed with SAFE or rescheduling. At the same time, like, we haven't historically had a lot of progress under Republican administrations either. So no matter who's the president right now, I'm not really that optimistic that we're going to get some form of federal legalization, which there's a lot of companies who don't even want it anymore. Like, how does it help Curaleaf or TrueLeaf or GTI, who've invested massive amounts of money in siloed statewide manufacturing facilities, to now have to consolidate that into a single? I mean, TrueLeaf might be the best position for it because they're so focused around Florida and a lot of the Southeast.
Like 300 stores like that.
Yeah, it's crazy. They spent $140 million trying to pass Amendment 3 last year, and they failed by a few points. And like, they just launched a hemp beverage, right? Which, by the way, if anybody from TrueLeaf is watching, you guys need to fix your pricing, because $9 a can for a 5 milligram can is more expensive than Massachusetts dispensaries for rec was 4 years ago. Anyway, they could have, I always say they could have taken that $140 million and started the world's biggest hemp beverage company, because no one's capital. You know, the crazy thing about the hemp beverage space right now is, like, Brightfield Group, which may have had conservative estimates, said last year we went from 100 million in national sales to 384 million national sales for hemp beverages, and that this year it could be north of 500 or 600 million. And no one wants to invest in this right now. It's crazy.
I know.
Like, you never see
it anywhere. Yeah. Well, I think that, like, the reason why, I mean, there's a lot of reasons, of course, and I can't read every, investor's head, never mind VCs. I mean, I'm going to consider VCs. But what I hear when I talk to investors is that, well, you're kind of CPG, but you're also kind of weed. And weed has taken, because everybody thinks that every weed company is just like a publicly traded stock. And the publicly traded stocks have just been beaten down over the last 5 years. Yeah. So it's just like, well, why would I ever invest in something like that?
We certainly see more people investing in hemp beverages who have historical backgrounds in cannabis and therefore more risk tolerant. And then despite the hemp beverage category growth, almost all of them have huge public positions in like marijuana companies, right? So they all just got eaten alive over the last 3 years, especially even the last 2 weeks. Yeah. They've just gotten absolutely desperate. It's not like they're sitting on a whole bunch of capital they're ready to redeploy. Right. And then traditional CPG investors are taking a look at it. I think a lot of them are different. I think we'll see some of the bigger VC names, especially those who are more interested in Vice, get involved, at least in the next 12 months, alcohol investors, such like that, which I think is more akin to what we're talking about here.
Yeah. I think the Vice investors absolutely kind of get it. And they're definitely more risk tolerant for the regulatory risks.
And I think that's really what it is right now, right? We face huge regulatory risks. The Farm Bill is sort of a sword of Damocles hanging over our head, no matter how low that percentage is. When there's a percentage chance that sometime in the next 12 months, everything is banned, gone, then it's hard to make that justification. But with the risk level so low at the Farm Bill, and we're still fighting at the state levels all the time.
Or in the local levels, absolutely.
Even the local levels. But at the same time, you have the same thing in alcohol. Every state has different alcohol laws. And some places have, Utah's completely dry or something like that. I don't know all the laws off the top of my head. We still have dry counties here in Massachusetts, I think. All that's going to keep happening. And eventually, as long as we have the federal underpinning continue to exist, we will continue to fight back those laws. Alcohol, it's funny, I spend a lot of time on lobbying these days, but you know who's still spending time on lobbying? Alcohol companies. Prohibition went away 100 years ago. That didn't mean they stopped. That actually meant that was the starting gun for them. Right. And you don't stop fighting for it. Even if you pass like a reasonably good law, there's always improvements you can make. So I'm trying to build an industry that's regulated and taxed, that's going to be here so that my children, my children's children continue to lobby for better hemp laws in this country. And so when people, I like to think of myself as somewhat, politically savvy in the sense that, like, I'm not a maximalist. I don't need to have everything for a bill to be good, but I do need to have it, be acceptable. But at the same time, some people don't want to like work with me on a law if it's only a 5 milligram cap. I sell a lot of 10 milligram products, so I'm very invested in having 10 milligram cap. But in places where I'm starting with 0, I'll go for 5. Right, of course. If I'm starting with whatever, then I don't want to go backwards. But at the same time, like, this is like the Massachusetts bill. I love 10s, right? But I also see it is completely fair to say, well, why should you be able to sell a 10 in a liquor store if I can only sell 5 in a dispensary? I think that's valid. I don't think you should be able to only sell 5 in a dispensary. In fact, I think you should be able to sell 100 milligram beverages in a dispensary like they do in Colorado and California with no issues, and you can sell a 5 or a 10 in a liquor store. I think that's the system we should have. It's not the system we're going to get. And so, it's about working with people, making choices, and trying to build coalitions. And that should be the way the democracy works, just as long as we still have a democracy.
Yeah, I think, and I always go back to that fair aspect, and I feel you mentioned a bunch of things, whether the hemp bill that's happening in Massachusetts right now, or whether it's just federal legalization or safe bank or whatever it is. Yeah. I think a lot of people are trying to figure it out still, even the marijuana operators that I'm closely tied to as well. we're all just trying to figure it out. And you kind of have to just play the hands you've been dealt.
Yeah.
Because it's not like all of a sudden you're going to be able to flip something that's going to happen at the federal level, especially.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like that one person is going to be able to make that difference. You have to do it through coalitions, really. You have to do it through something like the HBA, Hemp Beverage Alliance, which we're both part of.
Yeah.
So take me a little bit through so shout outs to HBA and Chris Lackner for like putting that together. Like there's a bunch of people in that group, and are they all aligned? Is everybody like on the same page generally?
No. I mean, even the board members aren't always aligned. Look, there's always going to be differences. This is the whole point. I think we're all competitors at the same time. That
I remember actually one discussion before. I hate to cut you off so quickly, but like I remember one discussion actually. Somebody in the group was like, "Oh, Delta 8's going to get banned and all those other things." We're like, and everybody, 90% of the people are like, "Yeah, should be." Or whatever. Everybody's like, "Yeah, go."
That's true. I mean, look, there's still are Delta 8 beverages out there. There's a couple even good ones. Delta Bevs, which is maybe like secretly the largest cannabis.
Do you think they're
company.
the biggest? I think
they might be the biggest. It's hard to tell because we don't have really good data out there, but they might be the biggest. And they used to be called Delta 8 beverages. That's where they started in the very early days of this, and now they're just Delta beverages, and they're incredibly successful. They're not in the HBA as far as I know, or at least they're not active in the HBA. But the high seltzer is a Delta 8 product. I think they've converted to Delta 9. Actually, I have no idea.
But some people are talking about like different caps. For instance, the HBA has like a recommended guidelines of what what the HBA as a group is agreeing to, which I think is it a 5 mg cap or a 10 mg cap?
10 mgs, I think, is the suggestion.
But you have a 50 mg.
I have a 50 milligram product. It's technically 10 servings of 5. It's the reclosable exo lids on everything. And so I think, there's a lot more of these spirit style bottles like Pamos and Breeze has one now. And nowadays, famously, I think of our 50 meg as our version of that. We launched those before the 10s actually in Minnesota when that was allowed because we knew how much of a market there was for higher dose products. Some people like me do use them that way. I'll pour our grape soda over a big rock and drink it like whiskey, basically a fifth to a third of a can in an evening and then put it back, come back to it the next day. Some people chug the whole thing. So it's really dependent. I believe in the personal freedom to be able to choose how much THC you can consume. And while that's not always politic in certain states, they do very well in the markets they're in. But our focus is around 5s and primarily 10s, which is where we see, I think about 35% of the market is 5 milligram, about 50% is 10 milligram, and then, the balance is everything else.
Okay.
The slowest things are almost always the microdoses. I know that is what everybody in the market, including me, when I started this company, you remember, everything was 3 mgs, everything was 3 THC, 2 CBD. That was actually we had the same profile. And it
worked great for me.
Yeah, it worked great for me too. And that's what I wanted. And that's where we all said the future was. At the same time, Levia launched with a 5 milligram, kicked our asses. It was pretty clear pretty quickly that people wanted especially in dispensaries, people wanted the stronger drinks. But it's also true in liquor stores. Not everybody needs more than 10, but it seems like more people are interested in consuming one stronger beverages than multiple small ones. Now, maybe that does change in the future. A lot of people have been saying that to me for a very long time.
I still believe in the low-dose consumer.
I believe they exist. I just believe that if they're consuming any real amount of beverages that I care about, they'll pretty quickly be a 5 and 10. I mean, if somebody's buying 3 milligram packs and they're drinking cannabis beverages every day, it's not like alcohol where you're just going to keep drinking those those beers at 5% beers every day, and that's to be drinking. Because beer is not, or alcohol's not a thing where you start with beer and then you progress to liquor. But cannabis is more of a thing where you start with lower dose stuff and you progress to higher dose things. And so, while I think low dose definitely is the primary need for on-premise, if that is ever going to become a large thing, I don't think the majority of sales in the future is sub 5 milligrams. I think it's 5 and it's 10, and that's it. And I think when people tell me my 2.5, my 3 is what is going to work long term, I just say, you will be back to me in a year and you'll tell me, oh, I'm coming out with the 10 milligram.
Exactly.
Which I've seen happen multiple times now. It's not because they're wrong that we want to bring in more people through low dose. I just think that people who buy the most today are looking for stronger stuff. I think that in the long term, the people who would buy the most will be looking for the stronger stuff because the daily consumer will need more than 3 milligrams. The 3 milligrams will be reserved for people who are trialing things and therefore will always be one of the small segments.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, we have a 1,000 milligram product, so you know what I mean?
And it does pretty well as far as I've seen.
I think the 1,000 milligram, on a per unit basis, our 500 milligram still sells the best.
Okay.
But the 1,000 milligram sells really well as well.
You guys ever do shots of that or?
Not me personally, no. But like, there are people, I think there was a YouTube video somebody put out one time. I commented on it and I think it got removed, but it was like, I think they had like a watermelon 500 milligram product, and they were taking like a couple dropperfuls. So it was like 50 milligrams maybe they took in one kind of spot, and they're like, I don't feel it yet, and they just chugged the whole bottle on camera.
Yeah, how fast did they expect that to happen?
Exactly, right? And so, but it was like he turned the camera off, camera came back on, and he was just like, I feel it. He was like gone. You know what I mean? It was classic. But yeah, so we do have people love weed. That was one of the things that was, as a person who lugs the 3 migs, 5 migs, you know, maybe in one night I'll have like up to 10 migs myself. I'm not a huge consumer in that sense of actual milligram count.
Yeah.
You know, just to be able to casually drink a couple of good feels for me is awesome. But there are people who just love weed.
Yeah.
And that's where I feel like a lot of the controversy comes from. It's because I see them as, you're seeing them as a gradual kind of like, hey, you start here and you kind of go up, right?
Yeah.
Where I see it right now, you know, and I always hold it to say I can always change my mind, but I still see them as 2 distinct type of audiences, right? There are people who just love weed. Maybe they have, you know, they have their gram carts that they pick up, their 510 carts, or they've got their pre-rolls, or, you know, they love packing bongs or whatever. And maybe when they can't pack a bong, they'll have a drink, right? Yeah. But for the most part, for the people who are coming into cannabis for the first time and they're trying, you know, a 5 milligram product, and they're like, hey, I'm good here. But after a little bit, they're like, oh, I can have like 2 or 3 of these now, almost like how beer tolerances happen. I don't necessarily see them picking up a bong the next day.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I mean, look, I've converted as a guy who used to smoke 8 spliffs a day back in my heyday down to like I'll have a drink of 1 beverage or 2 in a day. I think what we're learning is, and I did a poll on Twitter about this, was like, how do you consume? Do you prefer to have one stronger beverage, or do you prefer to have multiple? It was multiple weaker beverages, and it was almost completely split, but it skewed towards the one beverage. And I asked myself, is this more like a White Claw or is this more like a Celsius? To people, I think part of it is because we don't have instant onset, the way that alcohol, like 10 to 15 minutes is a huge improvement over traditional edibles, but it's not instantaneous. Yeah. And so I think people are more interested in having one beverage in a more intimate setting. I still don't think that many people in the long term are really going to be that comfortable socializing. We have a long distance to go there.
I believe
I'm not that comfortable socializing even on 5 milligrams.
Yeah.
I have to be with close friends and family for me to want to do that. Yeah. I did that at a family trip with, you know, some of my in-laws, and I felt comfortable, but I can't have like a 5 milligram and come on this podcast because I'll just be paranoid and anxious the whole time. I need a more mindful state for that. And so I wonder where people, this is what we're always watching, right? We're trying to figure out who is our customer, who do we want our customer to be? And I think a lot of people getting into the business start with who they are building for, who they are pretending the customer is without actually knowing it. And being in this for, 4 or 5 years now, you've made a product pivot, I've made a product pivot. It's not like the majority of my sales are 50 milligrams, but they do pretty well. And I'm always happy to offer people more choice where I can. And I think that is ultimately why a lot of Australian cannabis is to provide access. I can provide somebody in Tennessee legally a 50 milligram beverage. I can't be selling them weed at a rec dispensary in Tennessee. So they, we're providing options here.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of THCA flower in Tennessee too, which I have employees there. I'm like, I want you to send me those COAs if you're going to buy that product, because I don't trust that product.
Yeah. I mean, I think THCA flower specifically is probably the biggest egregious loophole.
It's like thing. And that's the thing is like
you're growing weed at that point.
Look, I don't like the word loophole because a law is a law, right? Like the way that you write the law is the way that you write the law, and it's incumbent upon lawmakers to, if they have an intent, to write a law that meets that intent.
But wait a second, it was 2018 when the Farm Act was done with 0.3% THC, not total THC, but Delta 9 THC.
And you don't think there's anyone in 2018 they could have consulted to find out how this all worked?
Maybe there might have been some
whether Mitch McConnell was willing to do that or not. Look, I mean, Mitch McConnell deserves all the credit for essentially legalizing cannabis.
Republican.
And as much as, and I say that because I know he doesn't want that credit.
Yeah.
The fact is, it's incumbent upon lawmakers to write the laws. Now, there are regulations that specifically say that THCA is actually counted in the total count of THC. Regulations are law. They're just not statute. What I've learned a lot about as a fake lawyer over the last 3 years is that There is the statute, there are the regulations, which are binding laws, but not written by a legislature. And then there's the enforcement of such laws. And it's the confluence of those three things and how they meet the court system that defines what's actually legal in this country and what's not. THCA flower is legal only because the Justice Department chooses not to enforce it, and because it's not held up in court to fight against it, and because people choose not to enforce it. At the end of the day, according to the USDA, it's legal. According to the DEA, it's legal. But they're not doing anything about it. And so the problem is not that you can create THCA flower from hemp. The real problem is that you've basically given people a catch-all mask to sell marijuana that is illegally grown as hemp, because no one can tell the difference.
Yeah.
So there are stories that in New York where they did try to do a crackdown in upstate on THCA flower, cops were going into stores and saying they could smell the difference between THCA flower and marijuana. And I'm like, no, you can't. That's not how this works. But like, to some extent, there is no real way to tell. Like, unless you have a chain of sourcing, which is not something that's legally mandated, that goes back to where it was originally grown.
What field it was grown in.
What field it was grown in. And by the way, it's hard to do that because, like, the USDA regulation says you can't do it, but at the same time, they only actually approve you for growing every, like, quarter or half a year or something. And so you can just, as long as your test result at the time of inspection doesn't have hot THCA, then you can grow THCA after that. It still comes from USDA compliant farm. I feel fairly confident 95% of the THCA hemp flower that's sold in this country is just illegally grown marijuana that people are calling THCA hemp flower. And people get away with it because of that. But the thing is, like, the marijuana issue have so much better leg to stand on if we didn't see reports every other week of massive testing fraud.
I was going to say testing fraud. Yeah.
It's just so rampant in this country that, you don't, like, and we smoked weed for so many years without any testing or regulations. It's hard to say that it's really the wrong way to do it, because at the end of the day, almost everybody in the industry who cares about the industry, they started probably before the legal industry started too. And so what arguments are we really making here?
Yeah. I don't, and I think everybody, like I said, is playing the cards they've been dealt, and some people are pushing it a little bit far and actually committing fraud.
I think
at
so.
Some point, because they're like, I need more market share. I get this product out. I'm not taking $100,000 loss on all these plants. Like, we got to get them done. And so they're figuring out how to get, clean test results.
Yeah, PSA for everybody, by the way, all COAs from real labs, they're encrypted, so you can't edit them, which means that if you can go in and edit a PDF and it lets you do that, that was never a real COA in the first place. So there are ways of telling if a COA has been completely forged, and people have been charged under RICO for fraudulent testing practices in hemp across the country.
Do you think that'll happen in Massachusetts?
I guess I don't see THCA flower in Massachusetts.
Well, I more mean about the testing fraud, the testing lab fraud that's happening right now.
Oh, I mean, that's a whole other sense of fraud, because that's just people submitting incorrect things to labs, or labs buffering them. I mean, there should be charges, I think, to a certain extent. I haven't paid that much attention to what's going on specifically in Mass with the testing, because I just haven't been here. But I don't buy cannabis I don't buy cannabis flower in Massachusetts. I mean, I don't really buy cannabis flower all that much. I guess I will occasionally do it, but certainly as somebody in the industry, or who was in the industry for a long time, I know from reputation which players not to buy from. Like, there's certain people, when it came out that yes, they were, the CCC like issued a notice that they were committing testing fraud and doing recalls. I was like, yeah, I've avoided all these players for years, because this was just industry-wide known.
Yeah.
The metric system, the big secret to it is that it's a gigantic scam. Like, I'm going to get attacked by metric for this, but I just don't think it really works. Like, it's basically a system to get people to purchase these plastic tags, put them on everything, and it doesn't actually protect anybody, because you could absolutely defraud the metric system without that much really recourse, because
it's up to the operator to do it the right way.
Yeah, it's up to it is sort of like a self-honor system, in which case, like, why don't we just have an honor system in the first place? Same way with alcohol, you do the reporting through TTB reports, and that's an honor system too, and it largely works. Like, the metric system kind of creates a layer where the public can feel like there's some level of things, but really just creates operational headaches that make everything more expensive.
Yeah, it's very expensive for us to stay on top of all that stuff. We have to do audits nonstop, basically. And there's always audits. There's always
triple check everything. You screw up one tag on a shipment going out, now it has to come back.
Yeah,
and you're paying for 2 drivers each way. Is that still a rule? Did they change that?
Well, it depends on the level. It's like over $10,000 of the product.
Most deliveries probably.
Most deliveries will have it. But yeah, so, and I don't remember the rules exactly if it just applies to delivery or transport, whatever. But the idea is that, yeah, it's an extreme, it's like among everything else from the federal side, which is 280E primarily, you know, you have to deal with all of these operational inefficiencies because you're constantly triple checking where every single tag is constantly. We have 2 inventory people now.
Yeah.
Just to stay on top of our
That's not like a huge facility.
No,
You know?
we have 1,800 square feet. We're tiny.
Yeah.
And we have 2 dedicated inventory people and 27 cameras. So yeah. But here we are, and we're here to stay. So we're in it for the long haul, and I'm sure you are as well.
Yeah, look, the security is important. It's probably, you don't need 100% coverage everywhere, but the government's really afraid that someone might get a single gram of cannabis out of here by, illicitly, and so they're gonna crack down on that. So,
all right, fantastic. All right, so we'll wrap here. Thank you so much. Any other shout outs you want to give, or any like how can people find Cantrip?
People can find Cantrip at drinkcantrip.com. You can see what products we have available. We have sodas and seltzers in a wide variety of dosing ranges. They can find us not on liquor store shelves in Massachusetts, but in a lot of other states if you're watching this in another state. And you can find us on Instagram at drinkcantrip, all of the normal places. We're pretty easy to find.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for your time, Adam.
Thank you, Jason. It was a pleasure to be here.